There are places in the Imperium where hope goes to die slowly. The refugee convoy drifting through the ghoul stars was one of them. 17 ships, barely void-worthy, held together by prayer, scavenged parts, and the desperate belief that if they kept moving, the galaxy might forget they existed. They came from worlds with names no one remembered anymore. Purged hives, heretic wars, Xenos raids that left nothing but ash and screaming. These were the ones who survived not because they were strong, but because they were lucky enough to run while others died. Families huddled in cargo holds that smelled of rust and fear. Children slept in corners where the cold seeped through the hull plating. Old men and women stared at bulkheads, remembering homes that no longer existed. No one spoke about what they had seen. No one needed to. Everyone carried the same scars. They believed they were hidden. They believed the Imperium had bigger wars to fight, bigger threats to crush. They believed that in the vast, indifferent dark between stars they might slip through unnoticed. They were wrong, but they did not know that yet. Among the refugees, a rumor began to spread. Whispers in the dark. Stories passed from ship to ship through crackling vox channels. A myth that should not have existed but did. A guardian walks the void. Some said he was a space marine who had abandoned his chapter. Others claimed he was an Adeptus Mechanicus experiment gone rogue. A few believed he was a demon, bound by ancient oaths to protect instead of destroy. No one agreed on what he was. But they all agreed on what he did. He saved people, not the important ones, not the lords or the generals or the saints. He saved the forgotten, the expendable. The ones the Imperium wrote off as acceptable losses in reports no one would ever read. A woman named Kale, who had lost 3 children to the void, told her remaining daughter about him. She described a figure in battered armor, walking through fire and vacuum without fear. A monster who killed other monsters so the weak could live another day. Her daughter, barely 6 years old, asked if the Guardian had a name. Kale did not know. No one did. But someone in the convoy, a salvager who claimed to have seen him once on the edges of a dying station, said the survivors there had called him something. Big Daddy. It was a strange name. Almost gentle. Almost human. It did not fit the myths of the Imperium, where heroes were saints and saviors were martyrs. But it fit him, because he did not demand worship. He did not ask for faith. He did not promise salvation. He just showed up when the darkness came. And he fought it. The convoy drifted on, engines burning low to avoid detection. The children drew pictures of a metal giant on scraps of parchment. The adults pretended not to hope. But in the quiet moments when the hull groaned and the stars outside looked too empty, they thought about him. And they wondered if, when the monsters came, he would come too. They did not have to wait long. The warp had other plans. It always did. In the cold mathematics of survival, belief meant nothing. Hope was not armor. Prayer did not seal hull breaches. But sometimes, just sometimes, a guardian heard the silent scream of those about to die. And sometimes he answered. The convoy did not know this yet. They only knew that the void outside their ships was darker than usual, that the stars seemed dimmer, that the ancient superstitions their grandparents whispered about, the ones about things that lived between reality and madness, suddenly felt less like stories and more like warnings. A tech priest on the lead ship noticed it first. The auger readings, fluctuations in local reality, microfractures in the fabric of space that should not exist outside a warp translation. He reported it to the convoy leader, an old woman named Thessa who had survived 4 purges and a demon incursion. She looked at the readings and felt ice settle into her bones. She had seen this before, on her homeworld. Right before the sky opened and hell poured through, she gave the order to increase speed, to scatter if necessary, to run. But the void does not care about orders, and the things that were coming did not care about fear. The warp disturbance hit like a hammer to the skull of reality. One moment the convoy was drifting through empty space. The next, the universe folded inward, and something that should not exist tore its way into the material realm. The ships lurched. Alarms screamed across every deck. Crew members scrambled to their stations, hands shaking, voices breaking as they tried to make sense of sensors that showed impossible readings. Reality was bleeding, and from the wound they came. Demonic predators, not the great powers, not the named horrors that shattered star systems and drove entire populations to madness. These were lesser things. The parasites of the warp that fed on fear and despair in the thin places where the veil grew weak. They crawled across the hulls of the refugee ships like insects born from nightmares. Claws that passed through metal as easily as flesh. Mouths that whispered promises in languages that made ears bleed. Eyes that reflected nothing but hunger. Hull breaches opened, not from impact, from presence. The demons simply existed and reality around them failed. Atmosphere vented into the void. People screamed. Children cried. The old and the weak were pulled toward the breaches, hands grasping for anything solid, finding nothing. The convoy had no weapons, no point defense systems, no way to fight back against enemies that laughed at physics and fed on terror. They were going to die, all of them. The families, the children, the ones who had survived so much already. It would end here in the dark, torn apart by things that existed only to cause suffering. Kale held her daughter tight, pressing the girl's face into her chest so she would not see the things moving outside the porthole. She whispered prayers she did not believe, promises she could not keep. And then, through the chaos and the screaming and the sound of metal tearing, someone shouted. On the hull of the lead ship, silhouetted against the stars and the bleeding warp rift, a figure stood. Big Daddy. He had come. No one saw him arrive. No ship detected his approach. He simply appeared as if the void itself had given him form and purpose. His armor was ancient, scarred by battles that predated the Imperium's current holdings, scorched by fires that should have melted any metal, dented by impacts that would have pulverized tanks. But he stood, unmoving in the face of things that made reality scream. And then he moved. There was no hesitation. No dramatic pause, no challenge or declaration. He simply stepped forward and began killing. His fist connected with the nearest demon, and the creature exploded into warp stuff and shrieking essence. His boot came down on another, crushing it into the hull plating with a force that sent shockwaves through the ship's structure. The demons turned toward him, recognizing threat, recognizing prey. They swarmed. Big Daddy tore through them like they were made of smoke. His hands ripped limbs from bodies that barely qualified as bodies. His shoulders absorbed claws that should have shredded ceramite. His helmet, that strange diving apparatus from ancient Terra, reflected nothing of the madness around him. He was a void in the chaos, a point of absolute solidity in a reality that was trying to tear itself apart. The refugees watched through portholes and cracked view screens, unable to process what they were seeing. Children stopped crying. Adults stopped praying. Everyone just stared. Because this was not a space marine fighting with zeal and fury. This was not an Imperial hero shouting litanies and oaths. This was something else. Something that fought with the calm, methodical efficiency of a machine built for one purpose and perfected over centuries. Protection. Big Daddy walked the length of the convoy, moving from ship to ship across the naked void without tether or thrust pack. Where hull breaches gaped open, he bent metal back into place with his bare hands, sealing them as best he could. Where demons still clung to the ships, feeding on the fear inside, he peeled them off and crushed them into dissipating essence. He did not speak, not once. No battle cries, no oaths, no reassurances. He simply worked. The warp rift continued to pulse, spilling more predators into real space. But they hesitated now. Something in their nature, some primal recognition of threat, made them wary. Big Daddy did not care. He moved toward the rift itself, walking across the hull of the furthest ship, positioning himself between the tier and reality in the convoy. And he stood there. The demons tested him. One lunged. He caught it mid-flight and tore it in half. Another tried to phase through him. He grabbed it anyway, somehow finding substance in the immaterial, and crushed its skull. They kept coming. He kept killing. For 17 minutes he held that position. And then, as suddenly as it had opened, the warp rift collapsed. Reality sealed itself. The remaining demons shrieked and fled back into the immaterium, their feeding ground denied. The convoy floated in sudden, shocking silence. Big Daddy stood on the hull, surrounded by dissipating warp essence and scorched metal. His armor was smoking. His joints moved with the grinding reluctance of overtaxed systems. But he was still standing. Inside the ships, no one moved. No one spoke. The moment felt too fragile, too impossible to trust. Kale's daughter pulled her face from her mother's chest and looked out the porthole. She saw him there, the metal giant standing alone against the stars. She whispered he came. Kale could not speak. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face. Not from fear, from something else. Something she had not felt in so long she had forgotten the name for it. Relief. Big Daddy turned his head, scanning the convoy one last time, checking for remaining threats, finding none. Then, without ceremony or acknowledgement, he stepped off the hull and drifted into the black. The refugees did not move for a long time. They stood at their portholes, watching the empty space where he had been, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Someone had protected them, not because they were important, not because they had earned it, not because the Emperor willed it, just because they needed it. And in the Imperium of man, that was the most dangerous miracle of all. The convoy moved on. Engines burned brighter now, pushing them deeper into the frontier zones where Imperial oversight was thin and questions were rarely asked. The survivors felt something they had not felt in years. Not safety. Safety was a lie in this galaxy. But the absence of immediate death. For some that was enough. They repaired what they could, sealed the hull breaches properly, cleared the debris, held quiet services for the 7 people who had been pulled into the void before Big Daddy arrived. 7 dead, out of thousands. In the mathematics of Imperial warfare, that was a miracle. But the refugees did not think in terms of acceptable losses. They thought in terms of names. The woman who had shared her rations, the old man who told stories to the children, the young couple who had just discovered they were pregnant, but not forgotten. Kale helped with the repairs, working alongside others in the makeshift engineering crews. Her daughter stayed close, drawing pictures on scraps of parchment. Always the same image, a figure in armor, standing between stick figures and scribbled monsters. The other children started drawing them too. Soon, crude diving helmets decorated every surface in the refugee quarters. Symbols of something the Imperium did not teach. That protection could come without price. That guardians could exist without demanding worship. Thessa, the convoy leader, watched this happening and felt unease settle into her bones. She was old enough to know how the Imperium worked, how it thought, how it responded to things that disrupted the established order. She pulled Kale aside one evening in a quiet corridor where few passed. Those drawings, you need to stop them. Kale frowned. They are just children. It gives them comfort. Thessa shook her head. Comfort is dangerous. The Imperium does not like unauthorized hope. If they find out about him, about what he did for us, they will not see salvation. They will see contamination. Kale stared at her. He saved us. And that is exactly the problem. Kale wanted to argue, wanted to defend the Guardian. But she saw the fear in Thessa's eyes and understood. The Imperium did not celebrate miracles it did not control. But it was already too late. Light years away, in a fortress monastery that did not appear on any Imperial charts, an astropath named Vessa screamed. She had been monitoring the sector for anomalies, tracking warp disturbances, logging Xeno's activity, standard duty for an astropath in Inquisitorial service. But this signal was different. It was not the roar of chaos, not the chittering madness of tyrannid hive minds, not the cold cruelty of Drakari raids. It was hope. Thousands of minds, all thinking the same thing at the same moment, all feeling the same impossible gratitude, all believing in something the Imperium had not given them permission to believe in. The psychic echo was so pure, so concentrated that it burned through the warp like a beacon. Vessa collapsed from her meditation throne, blood streaming from her nose, her augmetic implants sparking. Servitors rushed to stabilize her. Medici teams administered sedatives. But the damage was done. The signal had been received and recorded. Her handler, Inquisitor Kareth, reviewed the psychic transcript personally. He sat in his private chamber, surrounded by data slates and purity seals, reading the echo over and over. They survived. He saved them. The Guardian is real. Kareth closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of frustration. Not anger. Frustration. Because he understood exactly what this meant. A pattern was forming. And patterns in the Inquisition's experience were either tools or threats. This one was a threat. He pulled up the historical records. Cross-referenced survivor testimonies from across the sector. The data was fragmentary, scattered across decades and dozens of incidents. But when assembled, it painted a clear picture. An entity, unidentified, operating independently of Imperial authority, intervening in situations where civilians were threatened, disappearing without explanation, saving people who should have died. That was the problem, not the saving itself. The Imperium saved people every day. Entire armies existed for that purpose. But this entity saved without asking for tithes, without demanding faith, without reinforcing the Imperial creed. It offered protection as a gift, not a transaction. And that, Kareth knew, was heresy of the most insidious kind. Because if people believed they could be saved without the Imperium, they might start asking why they needed the Imperium at all. 10,000 saved today, 100,000 questioning tomorrow, 1 million in rebellion next year, 10 million dead in the civil wars that followed. The mathematics were clear. Kareth began drafting orders, not out of cruelty, not out of malice, out of duty. The refugee convoy had to be intercepted. The survivors had to be contained. The pattern had to be broken. He assigned the task to Enforcer Captain Dant, a man whose service record was exemplary precisely because he never questioned orders, never hesitated, never allowed emotion to interfere with duty. The orders were clean, legal, sanctioned by authorities that did not need to explain themselves. Intercept the convoy. Detain all refugees for quarantine and processing. Eliminate any resistance. Secure all information regarding the unauthorized entity. Standard contamination protocol. Kareth signed the document and transmitted it into the void. He did not feel guilty. Guilt was a luxury the Imperium could not afford. He thought about the greater good, about the trillions of humans living under Imperial protection, about the thin line between order and chaos. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was doing the right thing, even if it meant condemning thousands of innocents, even if it meant destroying the hope that had kept them alive, because hope without control was just another form of heresy. And heresy, no matter how beautiful, had to burn. The convoy drifted on, unaware that their salvation had already become their death sentence. The children kept drawing. The adults kept whispering stories. And somewhere in the dark, Big Daddy continued his patrol, not knowing that the Imperium had just decided these people were no longer worth saving. The void stretched endlessly around them all, cold, waiting. And in 3 days, the Imperium would arrive. The Imperial task force dropped out of the warp with the kind of precision that spoke of centuries of military discipline and absolute certainty of purpose. 3 frigates, hulls painted in the gray and gold of the Segmentum Obscurus fleet. Gun decks armed, boarding pods loaded, orders clear and unambiguous. They moved into position with the calm efficiency of predators that had never known defeat. The refugee convoy detected them immediately. Auger screens lit up with contact warnings. Alarms began their panicked wailing. Crew members shouted across Vox channels, voices breaking with fear that had nothing to do with demons or Xenos. Because this was worse. This was the Imperium. Thessa stood on the bridge of the lead ship, staring at the tactical display. 3 Imperial frigates, each one capable of reducing the entire convoy to debris without breaking formation. She had known this would happen, had felt it in her bones from the moment the children started drawing diving helmets on the walls. Hope was a signal, and the Imperium always answered signals it did not send. Beside her, the convoy's navigator, a young man barely 20 years old, asked the question everyone was thinking. What do we do? Thessa closed her eyes. What could they do? The frigates were faster. Fight. They had no weapons. Surrender? They were already condemned. She opened her eyes and gave the only order that made sense. Maximum burn. Make them work for it. The convoy broke apart, ships peeling away in different directions, engines flaring desperately. It was futile. They all knew it. But dying while running felt better than dying while waiting. The Imperial frigates did not pursue. They simply adjusted their formation, creating a net that no civilian ship could escape. Then they waited. Patient. Inevitable. A Vox transmission cut through every channel in the convoy. Cold. Backed by the authority of the God Emperor himself. This is Enforcer Captain Dant of His Imperial Majesty's punitive fleet. You are ordered to cease acceleration and prepare for boarding. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance will be met with immediate termination. You have 10 minutes to acknowledge. Inside the lead ship, Kale held her daughter close. The girl was crying, pressing her face into her mother's shoulder, whispering questions Cale had no answers for. Around them, other refugees stood frozen. Some prayed, some wept, some just stared at nothing, faces blank with the kind of despair that came from having hope ripped away after you had finally allowed yourself to feel it. An old man, someone Cale had shared rations with during the demon attack, spoke into the silence. "What did we do wrong?" A woman answered, voice bitter and broken. "We survived." Thessa transmitted the acknowledgement. She did not beg, did not plead. The Imperium did not care about pleas. It cared about compliance. The boarding began within the hour. Arbite's enforcers moved through the convoy ships like a plague of insects, completely without mercy or malice. They were tools of Imperial law, and the law did not have feelings. They separated families, tagged individuals with data markers that categorized them like cargo, scanned for mutation, heresy, warp, taint, unauthorized beliefs. The scans came back negative. All of them. The refugees were clean. No corruption, no taint, no deviation from acceptable human baseline. It did not matter, because the contamination they carried was not biological. It was ideological. Cale and her daughter were pulled into a processing line. An enforcer, face hidden behind an expressionless visor, ran a handheld auger over them. His voice was flat, mechanical. Contamination index positive. Unauthorized contact with unknown entity. Exposure to unsanctioned protection. Quarantine protocols engaged. Cale's heart stopped. She tried to speak, to explain, to beg. He saved us. We were dying. He saved us. The enforcer did not respond. He simply marked their files and moved to the next person. Her words meant nothing. Emotion meant nothing. Only the protocol mattered. Across the convoy, the scene repeated. Families torn apart. Children screaming for parents dragged to different holding cells. Old men and women who had survived purges and wars and horrors beyond description, broken by the simple cruelty of Imperial efficiency. They had survived demons. They had survived the void. They had survived the death of their worlds. But they could not survive being saved. On the bridge of his flagship, Enforcer Captain Danth watched the operation unfold through multiple picked feeds. His face showed nothing, not satisfaction, not regret, not even acknowledgement that he was watching human beings suffer. Just duty. An officer approached, data slate in hand. "Sir, preliminary scans confirm no visible signs of warp, taint, mutation, or Xenos influence. The refugees appear baseline human. All corruption indices within acceptable parameters." Danth did not look away from the screens. "Appear is not sufficient, Lieutenant. The Inquisition's orders are explicit. These individuals have been exposed to an unidentified entity of unknown origin and intent. That exposure constitutes contamination regardless of physical evidence. They are to be detained, quarantined, and processed for full psychic and genetic analysis." The officer hesitated. His voice dropped slightly. "Sir, some of them are children. They have committed no crime." Danth finally turned. His eyes were not angry. They were not cruel. They were empty. "Children grow into heretics, Lieutenant. Families spread corruption faster than plagues. The Imperium does not have the luxury of sentiment. We protect trillions by making hard decisions about thousands. Do you understand?" The lieutenant stiffened. "Yes, sir." "Then return to your station. And remember that every person we spare today could be the reason an entire world burns tomorrow. That is the burden we carry. That is the duty we accept." The officer left. Danth returned his attention to the screens. He did not enjoy this. He did not hate the refugees. He simply understood that the Imperium was not built on compassion. It was built on control, on the willingness to do what was necessary, no matter how ugly, to preserve the species. And if that meant condemning innocents to save the system, then that was the price of survival. Deep in the holding cells of the lead refugee ship, Cale sat with her daughter on a cold metal floor. The girl had stopped crying. She just stared at the wall, her small body shaking. Cale whispered the only prayer she remembered, the one her mother had taught her before the purge, the one that promised the Emperor protects. She did not believe it anymore. The words tasted like ash. Outside, in the cold void between the ships, something moved. Sensors did not detect it. Augers did not register it. It was simply there, watching from the dark. Big Daddy had returned, and he understood with perfect clarity what was about to happen. The Imperium was not here to save these people. It was here to erase them. Big Daddy floated in the void between the Imperial frigates and the refugee convoy, perfectly still, analyzing the situation with the cold precision of a machine built for war. 3 Imperial warships. Estimated crew complement 4,000 per vessel. Weapons capability sufficient to annihilate the convoy 17 times over. Boarding parties already deployed. Refugees already detained. He calculated trajectories, response times, tactical vulnerabilities. The frigates were powerful, but they were not invincible. He could disable them. He had done it before. Tear through their hulls, destroy their engines, collapse their command structures. But that would mean killing Imperial personnel. Thousands of them. Men and women who believed they were serving humanity, who thought their orders were righteous. They were wrong, but they were not evil. And Big Daddy had never killed someone for being wrong. He drifted closer, moving through the sensor shadow between 2 frigates, invisible to their augurs. He watched the boarding operations through the transparencies of the refugee ships, saw the families being separated, the children crying, the old and weak being dragged to holding cells. He saw Kale and her daughter huddled on a cold floor, hope dying in their eyes. The girl who had drawn his picture, who had whispered thank you in clumsy letters. His systems ran probability assessments, success rates, acceptable losses, optimal outcomes. None of them saved everyone. He could not fight the Imperium and protect the refugees at the same time. He could not be in multiple places at once. He could not stop boarding parties while shielding ships, while disabling frigates. He had to choose. And the choice was simple, even if the execution was impossible. Get them out. Big Daddy moved. He did not charge the frigates. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared on the hull of the nearest refugee ship, next to the boarding umbilical connecting it to an Imperial vessel. And he tore it apart. Metal shrieked. Atmosphere vented in explosive decompression. The umbilical collapsed, severing the connection. Imperial enforcers still inside tumbled into space, arms flailing, voices lost to the void. Big Daddy did not watch them die. He was already moving to the next connection point. On the bridge of Danth's flagship, alarms exploded across every console. Officers shouted over each other, trying to make sense of sensor readings that showed impossible movements and structural failures. Danth's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Report. An officer, pale and shaking, stammered. Sir, we have multiple hull breaches. Boarding umbilicals compromised. Something is on the refugee ships. Something is tearing apart our connection points. Danth moved to the primary tactical display. Camera feeds flickered to life, showing external views of the convoy. And there, moving across the hull of a refugee transport with impossible calm, was a figure in battered armor. The entity. Danth had read the reports. He had reviewed the scattered testimonies. But seeing it was different. It moved with a precision that made Astartes look clumsy. With a strength that bent reinforced hull plating like cloth. Target that entity. All-point defense systems. Fire at will. The frigate's weapon batteries roared to life. Lost fire streaked across the void. Macro cannon shells detonated against refugee ship hulls, uncaring of collateral damage. Big Daddy walked through the barrage. Lost bolts glanced off his armor. Explosions washed over him like water. He did not slow, did not stop. He reached another umbilical connection and ripped it free with both hands. Then threw the severed metal at an approaching boarding pod, destroying it mid-flight. Inside the refugee ships, people felt the vessels lurch and heard the grinding of metal. They did not understand what was happening, but they heard enforcers shouting, felt the artificial gravity fluctuate, sensed the chaos spreading through their captors, and they dared to hope again. Big Daddy worked methodically. He severed every boarding connection, destroyed every umbilical, created a barrier of wreckage and debris between the Imperium and the refugees. But he could not be everywhere. On the far side of the blockade formation, 2 frigates adjusted position, moving to flank the convoy from a different angle. Boarding pods launched from secondary bays. Fighters screamed through the void, targeting the refugee ship's engines with surgical precision. Big Daddy saw them, calculated intercept vectors, assessed priorities. He could stop the boarding pods, or he could stop the fighters, or he could shield the engines from damage. Not all 3. He chose the pods. He launched himself across the void, moving with thrust bursts from damaged systems in his armor. He intercepted the first wave mid-flight, smashing through their hulls with fists and boots. Pods exploded in silent detonations. Bodies tumbled into the black. But while he fought, the fighters completed their attack runs. The rear ship in the convoy, a civilian transport carrying 234 refugees, lost main power. Its engines died. Maneuvering thrusters failed. It began to drift, helpless and exposed. Big Daddy turned. Too late. The frigate's main guns spoke. 3 lance strikes. Precise. The transport did not explode dramatically. It simply ceased to exist. Matter converted to energy. Lives ended in a microsecond of absolute destruction. 234 people. Families who had survived demons. Children who had drawn pictures of their guardian. Old men and women who had endured so much and asked for so little. Big Daddy floated in the void, staring at the empty space where the ship had been. His sensors detected no life signs, no escape pods, no survivor, just expanding plasma and scattered atoms. He had saved thousands, but he had failed 234. In the mathematics of war, that was victory. In the measure of what he had promised himself, it was failure. The remaining convoy ships, engines flaring with desperate power, broke away from the Imperial blockade. Big Daddy moved with them, positioning himself between the refugees and pursuing fire. He intercepted lance strikes with his own body, destroyed incoming ordnance, tore through fighters that got too close. He bled, systems failed, armor breached. But he did not stop. Behind him, the frigates began to slow their pursuit, not because they could not catch the convoy, because they had received new orders. On his command throne, Danth stared at the tactical display. He had lost 3 boarding umbilicals, 7 boarding pods, 14 fighters, over 200 personnel, all to one entity. His second officer spoke quietly. "Sir, we can still pursue. We have the speed and firepower to destroy them." Danth did not respond immediately. He watched the fleeing convoy ships, watched the entity moving with them, damaged but still functional. He thought about acceptable losses, about the value of continuing an engagement against an enemy that had just demonstrated it could inflict significant casualties on Imperial forces. He thought about the orders sitting in his secure communication buffer, the ones transmitted from Inquisitor Kareth less than an hour ago. Exterminatus protocol authorized. Danth made his decision. Recall all assault elements. Maintain pursuit range, but do not engage. Prepare cyclonic payload for deployment. The officer hesitated. "Sir, if we use exterminatus-grade weapons, there will be no prisoners to interrogate, no information to extract." Danth turned cold eyes on him. "There will also be no contamination to spread, no hope to inspire heresy, no entity to continue disrupting Imperial operations. Prepare the weapon." "Yes, sir." The frigates adjusted their formation, no longer pursuing aggressively, just following, maintaining sensor lock, waiting for the right moment to end everything. Inside the fleeing convoy, refugees celebrated their escape. They embraced. They cried with relief. They whispered prayers of gratitude to the Guardian who had saved them. They did not know they were already dead. They did not know that the Imperium had decided mercy was not an option. And Big Daddy, moving silently alongside them, damaged and bleeding, did not know that no amount of strength or will could stop what was coming. Because the Imperium did not negotiate with threats. It simply removed them. The order came through encrypted channels with the highest level of Inquisitorial authorization. Danth read it 3 times, not because he doubted its validity, but because he needed to understand the absolute finality of what he was being commanded to do. Target refugee convoy designation Epsilon 79er. Threat assessment critical contamination vector. Entity presence confirmed. Recommended action total erasure. Authorization code Vermilion Throne Absolute. Exterminatus. Not against a world. Against 17 ships carrying thousands of people whose only crime was surviving when the Imperium had expected them to die. Danth felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not regret. Not the weight of the lives he was about to end. He had been trained too well for that. Had served too long. Had made too many hard decisions to hesitate now. He gave the order. Prepare cyclonic payload. Target the convoy center mass. Fire on my mark. The weapons officer, a woman who had served on this ship for 12 years, hesitated for just a moment. Her hands hovered over the activation controls. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Sir, confirm no warp signatures. No Xenos bioform. Scans red baseline human. Are we certain about this?" Danth did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the tactical display, watching the convoy flee with desperate hope. "The Inquisition does not make mistakes, Lieutenant. And we do not question orders that carry Vermilion authorization. Arm the weapon." The officer's hands moved. Protocols engaged. Ancient technologies, designed to crack continents and boil oceans, powered up in the torpedo tube of an Imperial frigate. For 17 civilian ships. The cyclonic warhead armed with a deep thrumming that resonated through the ship's hull. A weapon that had ended rebellions and purged heresy from entire populations. Now aimed at refugees. Danth watched the targeting solution finalized. Optimal impact point calculated. Blast radius sufficient to ensure no survivors. No debris large enough to salvage. No evidence that these people had ever existed. He opened a ship-wide Vox channel. His voice was calm, professional, devoid of anything human. "All hands, this is the captain. We are engaging exterminatus protocols against a contamination vector. This action is sanctioned by the highest authorities of the Inquisition. We do not act out of cruelty. We act to preserve the Imperium, to protect trillions by removing thousands. Remember your oaths. What we do here today, we do for humanity." He closed the channel and gave the final order. The torpedo launched. It accelerated through the void, propelled by technologies that predated the Imperium's current form, carrying enough destructive force to turn a continent into glass. Inside the refugee convoy, sensors detected the launch. Alarms screamed warnings. People rushed to viewports, trying to understand what they were seeing. Kale stood with her daughter in the observation deck of the lead ship, watching the stars. They had believed they were safe, believed they had escaped. The girl was smiling for the first time in days, drawing another picture of the Guardian. Thessa's voice came over the ship-wide Vox. "Resign. All crew. The Imperium has fired an Extinction-class weapon at our position. Impact in 40 seconds. There is no escape. There is no defense. I am sorry. I am so sorry." The Vox cut off. Silence filled the ships. The kind of silence that came when hope died all at once. Kale pulled her daughter close. The girl looked up at her, tears already forming, and asked the question every child asks when they cannot understand. Kale had no answer. She just held her daughter tighter and whispered the only truth she knew. "I love you so much." Around them, other families did the same. Parents holding children, lovers embracing, old friends grasping hands. No curses. Just quiet acceptance that they had survived so much only to die anyway. Because the Imperium had decided they were inconvenient. The torpedo closed the distance. 30 seconds. 20. 10. Big Daddy was moving toward the convoy when his sensors detected the weapon. He analyzed its trajectory, its yield, its purpose. And he understood. He could not stop it, could not intercept it, could not absorb the blast. The weapon was too powerful, too absolute. But he tried anyway. He launched himself toward the torpedo, burning every reserve system he had, pushing damaged thrusters past their limits. He reached for it, arms extended, as if will alone could change physics. He was 3 seconds too slow. The torpedo detonated. The explosion was not fire. It was the fundamental breaking of matter. Energy released on a scale that rewrote local physics. A sphere of annihilation that expanded at near-relativistic speeds. The convoy ships did not explode. They did not burn. They simply ceased. Metal atmosphere, bodies, hopes, dreams, all converted to plasma and scattered across the void in an expanding wave of white brilliance that hurt to look at even through filtered sensors. Kale and her daughter. The old man who had shared rations. The children who had drawn diving helmets. The families who had survived purges and demons and the death of worlds. All gone. In 3 seconds of absolute light. The shockwave hit Big Daddy like the fist of an angry god. His armor buckled. Systems overloaded and failed. Hull breaches open across his chassis. He tumbled through space, spinning uncontrolled, internal warnings screaming. But his core remained active. His consciousness continued. He stabilized his rotation and turned back toward the blast site. There was nothing. No ships. No debris large enough to identify. Just a cloud of superheated particles and residual radiation. The convoy had been erased so thoroughly that in a few hours there would be no evidence it had ever existed. Big Daddy floated in the void, staring at the empty space. His damage was critical. Multiple systems offline. Power reserves at 18%. He needed repairs immediately or he would cease to function. He did not move. He just watched the dissipating cloud, running calculations that told him what he already knew. He had failed. On the Imperial frigate, Danth watched the blast readings and nodded once. Threat neutralized. Contamination purged. Mission successful. An officer asked quietly, "And the entity, sir?" Danth glanced at the sensors. The figure was still there, drifting near the blast epicenter. Damaged. Weakened. Possibly dying. He considered ordering a follow-up strike. But the entity was not the primary mission. The refugees were. And they no longer existed. Log it as a secondary concern for Inquisitorial review. Mark coordinates and last known capabilities. We have completed our objective. The officer hesitated. "Sir, should we not confirm the kill?" Danth turned away from the screens. "Lieutenant, we have just deployed an exterminatus-grade weapon. Nothing survives that. If the entity is still functional, it will be logged and tracked. But our duty here is done. Prepare for warp translation. We are returning to port." "Yes, sir." The frigates began their departure procedures. Engines flared. Warp drives powered up. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only void and radiation behind. And Big Daddy, still floating, still watching, still remembering every face he had failed to save. The galaxy did not care about his failure. It did not pause to mourn. It simply continued, cold and vast and indifferent. But he remembered, and that was all he had left. The debris field was vast and cold and wrong. This was not the natural death of ships destroyed in battle. This was erasure. The particles were too small. The heat signature too dispersed. Everything had been reduced to atoms and radiation. But Big Daddy searched anyway. His systems were failing. Power at 11% and dropping. Hull breaches across 60% of his chassis. Locomotion compromised. Sensory arrays damaged. Every alert in his consciousness screamed for him to disengage, to seek repairs, to preserve core functions. He ignored them all. He drifted through the expanding cloud of what had been the convoy, scanning for anything. Any fragment. Any piece large enough to prove these people had existed. For hours he found nothing. Just particles. Radiation. The afterglow of annihilation. Then his sensors caught something. A piece of hull plating. Barely 10 centimeters across. Tumbling slowly through the void. He maneuvered toward it, movement sluggish, power reserves draining with every course correction. He caught the fragment in his hand and brought it close to his optical sensors. It was scorched, melted at the edges. But in the center, protected by some random chance of physics, there was a mark. A drawing. Done in what looked like burned ration paste. A figure in armor with a round helmet. Stick figure people standing behind him. Scribbled monsters on the other side. And underneath, in letters that barely qualified as writing, "Thank you." Big Daddy held the fragment, his damaged systems focusing on it with every remaining sensor. His archive stored the image with perfect clarity, tagging it with timestamps and location data that he would never delete. This was all that remained. One fragment. One child's grateful drawing. 234 people reduced to this. He released the fragment and let it drift away, continuing his search. He found more pieces. A section of decking with boot prints still visible. A twisted piece of what might have been a child's toy, melted beyond recognition. A data slate, its memory core destroyed, but its casing still bearing the scratches of use. Each piece he cataloged. Each piece he remembered. Each piece a testimony that these people had been real. His power dropped to 7%. Non-essential systems began shutting down automatically. His vision narrowed. His movements became slower. He did not stop. On the third day, he found something that broke something inside him that he had not known could break. A section of hull from the lead ship. Larger than the others, perhaps a square meter. And painted on it, in careful strokes that spoke of time and effort, was a symbol. His symbol. A diving helmet. Rendered in surprising detail. Clearly recognizable. surrounded by smaller figures, families, children, all sheltering beneath it. And around the edges, names. Hundreds of them, written in different hands, different languages, some in Gothic, some in dialects he had to cross-reference to understand. The refugees had created a memorial, not to the Emperor, not to the Imperium, to him. They had painted his image on their ship like ancient humans had painted saints in cathedrals, had listed their names beneath it like an oath, a declaration. We believe, we are protected, we remember. Big Daddy floated before the fragment, his systems running processes he had no designation for. Something that approached grief, that touched on rage, that settled into a hollow understanding that no amount of strength could fix. He had not saved them. His protection had meant nothing against the Imperium's will. Their faith in him had been rewarded with annihilation. He had failed them completely, but they had not known that when they painted this. They had believed, had hoped, had trusted that their guardian would keep them safe, and he had tried. He had torn through Imperial forces, had damaged warships, had fought with everything he had. It had not been enough. It would never be enough, because the enemy was not demons or Xenos or traitors. The enemy was order itself, the vast, grinding machinery of the Imperium that valued control over lives, obedience over mercy, conformity over hope. You could not fight that with fists, could not punch doctrine, could not tear apart belief systems with strength. And yet, he had no other tools. His power dropped to 3%. Critical warnings flooded his consciousness. Core shutdown imminent. If he did not seek repairs within the next 6 hours, he would cease to function. He looked at the painted hull section one last time, at the names of people who had trusted him, who had died anyway. He tried to feel something, tried to process the weight of it, but his systems were too damaged, his power too low. All he could do was record, ensure that somewhere in his corrupted and failing data archives these people were not forgotten. He turned away from the debris field and began the long, slow drift toward the nearest salvage point. His movements were mechanical, automatic, pure function without purpose. Behind him, the fragments continued their eternal orbit. A graveyard without graves, a memorial with no visitors. The void stretched endlessly in all directions, cold, indifferent to suffering and sacrifice and the small, futile efforts of one damaged guardian who had tried to protect the helpless and failed. But even as his systems shut down one by one, even as his vision narrowed to almost nothing, Big Daddy held one image in his core memory, a child's drawing, a thank you written in clumsy letters. They had believed in him, even at the end, even as the torpedo closed in. That belief had not saved them, but it had mattered. And as long as his core remained active, as long as his consciousness persisted, he would remember that it had mattered, even if he was the only one who did. The report reached Inquisitor Kareth 17 days after the incident. It arrived through encrypted channels compiled from ship logs, sensor data, and Enforcer Captain Danth's personal testimony. Kareth read it in the quiet of his private chamber, surrounded by shelves of forbidden texts and artifacts too dangerous for common viewing. His thin face remained expressionless as he processed the information. Operation outcome, complete success. Contamination vector eliminated. No survivors. Entity designated unknown NL77 observed at blast site. Status unknown. Presumed damaged or destroyed. He turned to the attached data files. Picked captures of the entity. Sensor readings of its capabilities. Tactical analysis of its intervention tactics. What he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. The entity was not simply powerful. It was effective. It had disabled 3 Imperial frigates' boarding operations, destroyed military assets worth millions of thrones, killed over 200 Imperial personnel, all to protect people who had no strategic value, no military significance, no reason to exist in the Imperium's calculations. That was the problem. Kareth stood and walked to the viewing port in his chamber. Outside, the void stretched endlessly, dotted with distant stars that represented worlds under Imperial control. Trillions of lives, all maintained through strict order, absolute obedience, and the understanding that individual lives meant nothing compared to the species' survival. The entity threatened that order, not through conquest, not through corruption, but through the simple act of offering protection without demanding submission. Every person it saved became a question. A doubt. A crack in the foundation of Imperial doctrine. If this thing can save us without asking for tithes, why do we pay the Imperium? If this guardian protects us without demanding faith, why do we worship the Emperor? If salvation can come from outside the system, why do we need the system? Those questions, left unanswered, would spread like disease, would undermine centuries of carefully maintained control, would lead to rebellion, schism, and ultimately the death of billions in the civil wars that followed. The mathematics were clear. The entity had to be stopped, not contained, not studied, eliminated. Kareth returned to his desk and began drafting a new classification. His fingers moved across the data slate with practiced efficiency. Entity designation, unknown 077. Reclassification, priority alpha threat. Threat type, ideological contamination vector. Recommended action, immediate termination. Authorization, vermilion throne absolute. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Previous assessment was incorrect. This entity is not a protector. It is an attractor of instability. Its presence generates unauthorized hope, which spreads like a psychic contagion. Everywhere it appears, Imperial authority is questioned. Every person it saves becomes a potential heretic. The entity does not understand what it is doing. It believes it is helping, but it is actually destroying the very order that keeps humanity alive. Therefore, it must be hunted and killed, not as punishment, as necessity. Kareth signed the document with his personal seal and transmitted it to the appropriate channels. Within hours, it would reach Ordo Xenos, Ordo Hereticus, and specialized kill teams across the sector. A hunt was being organized, not against a demon or a Xenos warlord, against something that saved people. Because saving people without authorization was the most dangerous heresy of all. Kareth assigned the task to Inquisitor Valen, a specialist in tracking and eliminating entities that defied categorization. Valen had killed things that should not exist, had ended threats that had no name, had operated in the dark spaces where even other Inquisitors feared to go. If anyone could stop the entity, it was him. Valen accepted the assignment with his characteristic silence. He did not ask questions, did not require justification. He simply read the file, noted the entity's last known location, and began assembling his kill team. Deathwatch Astarte, Skitarii Hunter Servitors, assassins from the Officio Assassinorum, weapons capable of destroying Titan-class targets, ships equipped with experimental warheads that bent physics. This would not be a battle. It would be an execution. Kareth watched the preparations from his chamber, feeling nothing. Not satisfaction, not regret. Just the cold certainty that he was doing what had to be done. The entity had made its choice. It had interfered with Imperial operations, had saved people marked for death, had disrupted the order that kept humanity from tearing itself apart. Now it would pay the price. Kareth closed the report and turned back to his other duties. He had sectors to monitor, heresies to track, threats to assess. The entity was just one problem among thousands. But it was a problem that would be solved permanently. Somewhere in the void, Big Daddy drifted toward a salvage station, unaware that the Imperium had just escalated from containment to extermination, unaware that kill teams were being assembled, that weapons were being prepared, that his existence had been deemed too dangerous to tolerate. He only knew that he had failed, that people had died, that his protection had meant nothing. He did not know that the Imperium had decided his greatest crime was not failure. It was trying. The salvage station hung in the void like a corpse, barely functional, held together by desperation and illegal modifications. It orbited a dead star that gave no light, no warmth, just a collapsed remnant of something that had once burned bright. Big Daddy docked without permission, his damaged systems barely managing the approach. The station's inhabitants watched through cracked viewports and failing sensors, recognizing what he was even if they did not understand who he was. The Guardian. The thing that walked the dark places and fought monsters. None of them approached him. None offered help. They just watched as he dragged himself through their corridors, trailing sparks and leaking fluids that should not exist in his design, searching for what he needed. He found a repair bay in the station's lower levels, abandoned decades ago, filled with rusted tools and broken machinery. It was barely functional, but it was enough. He worked in absolute silence. No requests for assistance, no communication, just methodical mechanical repair. He replaced hull plating with scavenged metal, rerouted power conduits around damaged sections, welded breaches closed with crude but effective patches. His movements were slow, labored, each action costing power he barely had. 3 days passed, then 4, then 7. The station's inhabitants left him alone, some out of fear, some out of respect, some because they recognized that whatever he was doing, it was beyond their ability to help or hinder. On the 8th day, he was functional, not repaired, not whole, but operational enough to continue. He left without a word, walking back to his ship, if it could even be called that. More a collection of salvaged parts and ancient technologies held together by purpose rather than engineering. He departed the station into the void, setting course for the outer reaches where Imperial authority was thin and desperate people gathered in the forgotten spaces between stars. The galaxy had not changed. It was still cold, still vast, still completely indifferent to suffering or sacrifice or the small, futile efforts of guardians who could not save everyone. But Big Daddy continued anyway. He did not have hope. Hope was for those who believed things could get better. He knew they would not. The Imperium would continue grinding through lives. Demons would continue feeding on fear. Xenos would continue their wars. People would continue dying. Nothing he did would change that. But he would do it anyway. Because somewhere in the dark another convoy was fleeing. Another family was hiding. Another child was drawing pictures of safety that would never come. And when the monsters arrived, he would be there. Not because he could save them all. He knew now with absolute certainty that he could not. The Imperium was too vast, too powerful, too willing to burn the innocent to preserve its vision of order. But he would try. Because 234 people had died believing he would protect them. Because a child had drawn his picture and written thank you. Because somewhere in his corrupted data archives he carried the names of people who had trusted him. They had died anyway, but their trust had not been meaningless. It had given him purpose, not to win, not to change the galaxy, just to stand between the helpless and the dark for as long as his systems continued to function. The Imperium would come for him. He understood that now. They would send hunters. They would not stop until he was destroyed. That was acceptable. He had ceased to function before. He would cease again. But until that moment he would walk the void. He would answer distress calls no one else heard. He would fight battles no one would remember. Not for glory, not for recognition, not for the belief that things would improve, for the simple, stubborn refusal to let the galaxy be only what it was. A distress signal flickered across his sensors, weak, coming from a system 3 days away at maximum burn. He adjusted course and accelerated. His power reserves were low. His systems were compromised. His armor was patched and barely functional. It did not matter. Someone was screaming into the void, and he was the only one listening. The stars stretched endlessly before him, cold points of light in an infinite darkness, each one a sun, each sun surrounded by worlds. Each world filled with people living and dying in the grinding machinery of galactic indifference. He could not save them all, could not even save most of them. But he could save some, and some was better than none. Big Daddy flew into the dark, alone, damaged, carrying the weight of everyone he had failed and the faint, impossible hope that the next time would be different. It would not be, but he would try anyway, because that was all he had left. And in a galaxy built on cruelty and despair, sometimes trying was the most radical act of all.